Today on Meanbrews, I'm covering American Brown Ale. Let's get right into the data. We had 36 winning American Brown Ale recipes. We had 3 that were best of show. We had 17 gold, 6 silver, 4 bronze, and 6 that were award-winning recipes. This is BJCP Style 19C, a malty but hoppy beer, frequently with chocolate and caramel flavors. The hop flavor and aroma complements and enhances the malt rather than clashing with it. When I look at the data set that I've got from here and the recipes I received, there's a moderate amount of evolution over time, and I'll present that, as well as a moderate amount of variation between the recipes. People seem to want to tweak the malt bill or the hops to their liking. Looking at the original gravity, recipes ranged from 1.049 all the way up to 1.074. Not surprising, the mean is right on the high end of the BJCP range. At 1.059 is the mean. As far as IBUs, we're seeing a pretty surprising data set here. BJCP range is between 20 and 30, yet our mean is 41, well above the max. I think what we're seeing here is the IPA effect, and really BJCP should look at adjusting their range for this style, because I think it's just not reflecting today's tastes. That being said, we are seeing a little bit of a reduction in IBUs over time. I've been mentioned in the comments to look at the R squared to show how the data correlates to this line. I wouldn't take this as a values line to follow these values because this R squared value is so low. I would just note that it is trending down over time versus up. For color, we had a range from 16.5 to 38, pretty much between the BJCP range of 18 and 35. The average was 23 on the lighter end of the shades here. We are seeing that trend upward, a little bit better R squared value, but however, it is trending upward with time, so maybe it's getting a little bit darker than the average of 23. Probably shoot towards the mid-range here of 26, 27. For the malt types, for all recipes, the average was about 79.4% base malt, 11.5% crystal, 4.1% toasted malts, 4.2% roast, and 0.7% adjuncts. These are the average for all recipes, whether they use the malts or not. I'm doing a little bit different slide on this one. This one I'm showing the ranges people use those malts if they use them. So throwing out the people that, let's say, didn't use a roast malt, and what was the proportion that they used them in. So base malts, 100% of the recipes used a base malt at an average right here around 80%, but the range was, I think it was 79 we said in the last slide, but the range was somewhere around 64 to 90%. So this one now I'm showing that previous pie chart as a bell curve, so you can kind of see where your limits should be. The next most prominent with crystal, 100% used crystal malts at an average of probably around 12%, but as high as 27% of the grist. Pretty high. Roast was the next most prominent, 97% used roast malts, I believe, all the way up to around 12% here. So pretty big percentage of the grist. Probably the darker styles use that. The darker examples use that amount of roast. Toast, only 60% of the recipes used a toasted malt, anywhere from around 2% to 16%. The average is right again around 7.5% of the grist. And then for adjuncts, I think we only had 11% of the recipes used an adjunct, somewhere between 4 and 10% of the grist. I wouldn't recommend using an adjunct, just not frequently used and not prominent in the data set. Now for the base malts, the most common base malt was a pale malt, anywhere between 55 and 92% of the grist. 100% of the recipes used it, and the average was 78%. The next most prominent was Munich, 33. A third of the recipes used a Munich malt, at an average of 11% of the grist, some all the way up to 27% of the grist. And then we have wheat and Vienna used in some others. Yeah, wheat, 28% of the recipes used a wheat malt at an average of 6% of the grist, and then one recipe used a Vienna malt. Crystal malts, wow, lots of different crystals used here. Start with the most prominent, medium crystal. 72% of the recipes used a medium crystal or a Care Munich, something around crystal 60 at an average of 6% of the grist, but more than double was one recipe here, and all the way down to 1%, another recipe. The next most prominent is a light crystal, something between a crystal 10 all the way up to crystal 40. 42% of the recipes used a light crystal at an average of 8% of the grist. Dark crystal, 42% used a dark crystal at an average of 4.7% of the grist. And I don't think I share any of the others, but the next most prominent was Special B right here, about 27 at about 3% of the grist. 27% of the recipes used it. And then Carapils, about a quarter of the recipes used Carapils. And then one recipe used Golden Naked Oats, which is crystal oat malt. We are seeing a bit of a decline in crystal over time from around 12%, probably under 10%. Not really prominent, but does show a gradual trend towards reducing the amount of crystal malts. Toasted malts, the most prominent toasted malts is Biscuit Victory. This is the prominent flavor you get in Fat Tire. We had 50% of the recipes use a Biscuit or Victory malt at an average of 5.1% of the grist. And then we had some others here. Aromatic were used in about 3 recipes, and honey malt was used in about 4 recipes. Also some other home toasted malts, special roast, amber malt, and melanoidin. Roasted malts, we had the most prominent was a chocolate or a Carafa special. 92% of the recipes, a big proportion of the recipes used a chocolate style malt at an average rate of about 3.8% of the grist, but as high as 9%. Next was roasted barley at about less than a quarter of the recipes at about 1% of the grist. I wouldn't recommend using any of these. Some others that were used but not very prominent: brown malt, black patent malt, and coffee malt. Roast malts is increasing with time. Seeing a trend to increase from around 2%, probably around 5 or 6%, somewhere in that range. Kind of puts you in the middle of this data set here. Probably something that you should reflect if you're styling your own recipe. Adjuncts, I just showed this one. Brown sugar, flake barley, maple syrup, and molasses were used in a couple recipes each. Not very prominent. So do present this data, but don't put these in my recipe at the end. For bittering hops, the most prominent bittering hops were Cascade and Centennial, followed by a slew of other American-style hops. Doesn't really matter here for bittering. Flavor hops, now this is where it gets important. Cascade and Willamette, 31% and 28% respectively. And then Centennial, Fuggle, Northern Brewer, and some others there were used as flavor hop additions. Aroma hops, again, Cascade was the big winner, followed by Amarillo, Centennial, Willamette, and then some others were used as single hops in in 1 or 2 recipes. For Whirlpool hops, Cascade came out on top with, I think, 3 recipes using Cascade for the Whirlpool. Simcoe, Fuggles, and Willamette were second, each with 2 recipes each, and then a slew of other American type hops and Pacific Gem over here was used as well. Oh, that one didn't show. EKG is this blue one. For dry hops, again, not a lot of recipes use them. We'll get to that in a second. Cascade came out as a winner. Amarillo and Willamette, and a slew of other hops again for the dry hops. As far as the rate of hop additions, for flavor hops, which is the blue curve, 81% of the recipes used a flavor hop at an average of 0.16 ounces per gallon or 1.2 grams per liter. And a pretty big range from 0.05 to 0.32. For aroma hops, which is the black curve, 81% of the recipes used aroma hops at an average rate of 0.2 ounces per gallon or 1.5 grams per liter, We did have one outlier over here that used 3 times as much aroma hops as the average. Whirlpool hops, the green curve, big range here. Again, as much as 0.6 ounces per gallon, but the average was 0.33 ounce per gallon or 2.5 grams per liter. Only 22% of the recipes used a Whirlpool hop. Dry hops, 31% of the recipes, just above the threshold where I'll use them in my recipe. At an average rate of 0.22 ounces per gallon or 1.6 grams per liter. We are seeing an increase in the late hop addition and Whirlpool hop addition. Both aroma and Whirlpool are increasing over time, meaning people are making these beers taste more hoppy to go along with the IPAs becoming more and more prominent. Mash types, 4% of the mash were decoction of the ones that were reported to me. 19% were step mash. 77% were single infusion mashes. We're going to stick with a single infusion for this style. As far as the rests, 15% of the recipes did a protein rest at 126 Fahrenheit or 52 Celsius for an average duration of 22 minutes. Only one recipe did a beta rest at 145 Fahrenheit or 63 Celsius for 30 minutes. And for the sacrification rest, 154 Fahrenheit was the mean or 68 Celsius with a 1 hour rest being the average. Boil duration, we had again from 60 to 105 minutes. The average was 73 minutes, but you're seeing over time, this is trending, normalizing down to just an hour-long boil. For the yeast used, Chico strain is by far the most prominent strain used for this style, followed by some others, another American or British types of, or Scottish even, types of yeast. I'm going to stick with Chico for my recipe just because look at this. So prominent. Water chemistry. Calcium was anywhere between 80 and 140 with an average of about 92. Magnesium, the average was around 9. Sodium, the average was around 22 parts per million. Sulfate with a range from 65 to 300 with an average of around 110, 105, around there. Chlorides was between 30 and 95 with an average of around 70. For the fermentation temperature, we had a big range between 58 and 70. The average was 66 Fahrenheit or about 19 Celsius. Other variables, 2.4, 2.45 was the average carbonation volume for this style, and the pH, mash pH was 5.38. Now on to the recipe. I'm going to start out with 73% pale 2-row malt, 6.4% biscuit or victory malt. You can use Crystal 80 or Crystal 60, about 5%. Chocolate malt. Try to choose maybe the color of the chocolate malt to suit the final color you want. This is the big color modifier for this style. I just chose the 473, whatever, to get the color that I wanted. Caramel malt, like Crystal 30, 3.5%. You can use a Crystal 20 if you can get it. Munich 1, probably Weyermann, 3.5%. Dark Crystal, here I just picked a 170, but a 120. Anything above 90, I think, is going to give you those dark crystal flavors that you want. 2.1% of the grist. And then a little bit of white wheat at 1.6%. For hops, my bittering hops are going to be Cascade. I'm going to get about 21.5 IBUs out of Cascade at 60 minutes. I'm going to use 0.07 ounces per gallon or 0.52 grams per liter of both Cascade and Willamette at 15 minutes. I'm going to use 0.13 ounce per gallon or 0.97 grams per liter of both Cascade and Willamette at 5 minutes. I'm going to use White Lab 001, as I talked about before. And I'm going to dry hop. I'm going to do a 7-day dry hop at 0.22 ounce per gallon or 1.65 grams per liter towards the end of the fermentation. My original gravity, I'm going to shoot for 1.060. I didn't show it trending, but it is slightly increasing, so that's higher than the average. IBUs, I'm going to shoot for 35, which meets that trend line down. For my water chemistry, I'm going to use 85 parts per million calcium, 8 magnesium, 23 sodium, 66 chloride, 105 sulfate, and whatever your bicarbonates come out to be with whatever water you use. I'm going to shoot for about 5.39 or 5.38 mash pH, and infusion mash at 154 for 60 minutes. Mash out in sparge, and I am going to ferment at 66 Fahrenheit and raise it a little towards the end. My yeast starter, I'm going to use a 2-liter starter for a 5-gallon batch, so that's about 0.4 liters per gallon of wort that you want to ferment. Transfer it to a keg and bottle condition at 2.41 volumes of CO2. Just a note here, if you do use Brewfather, all of my recipes are now on Brewfather. I'll link to it in the description of this video. And you can go on there and you can download any of my recipes, Meanbrews Recipes. That's it for Meanbrews for this episode. So tune in 2 weeks. I'm going to put on Reddit another poll to see what style we should do next. Maybe let people suggest it, but I think Reddit, if you haven't been to the Reddit homebrewing page, it's pretty fantastic. There's, I think, 1 million Redditors in the homebrewing subreddit. So go check it out. Lots of good questions, lots of good resources there. And thanks for tuning in. Please subscribe and hit that notification bell. And we'll look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks. Thanks. Bye-bye.